Hello, everybody. John Hyatt, and back with some more family history information. Uh, this time, I'd like to talk about my wife's family, the Stevens family. I'm married to Cheryl Marie Stevens Hyatt. We got married in 1985. Um, what I would like to talk about today is her direct paternal line, the Stevenses. This is going to be part of a somewhat longer discussion that will involve more than one video. Um, Both Cheryl's family and mine go back to the very beginning of America at Jamestown. Um, right now, I don't have all the documentation to apply for one of the hereditary societies. I particularly have one gap where I don't have paper. Um, but I want to give you the Stevens side of this connection. And so I'm going to start by working backward. Instead of starting at Jamestown, I'm going to start with Cheryl. Her dad is Lyndall Stevens, and her grandfather is Edward Stevens, who married Eddie Rue McElhannon. So we're back to within living memory. So when we go back before Edward Stevens, his father was William H. Stevens that married Beulah Skinner. William Stevens' father was John Newton Stevens, who married Nancy Cruz. And his father was Joseph A. Stevens, who married Chrissy White. Now, for the Stevens family that are around Gwinnett County, Joseph A. Stevens was one of the early settlers in Gwinnett County, and in fact, he lived not far from where I used to live out on Highway 29. The church out there is Bethesda Church, and he lived in that area. And he fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side. He fought at Gettysburg. And I believe he's buried out toward Jefferson, Georgia. So that's the Civil War generation of her family. The father of Joseph A. Stevens, and as you can see, I'm going to have to refer to notes for this episode. Um, the Joseph A. Stevens who fought in the Civil War was Joseph A. Jr., really, because his dad is also Joseph A. Stevens, who married Anna Morgan. That's another interesting line, is the Morgans. We'll talk about those probably sometime. The father of Joseph A. Stevens was Isaiah Stevens, who married Ann Henderson. And the father of Isaiah Stevens, and I believe Isaiah Stevens was a preacher. He might have been a Baptist preacher. Um, I'll have to check the Stevens ledger to make sure I'm correct on that. But the father of Isaiah Stevens is Joshua Stevens. Now, Joshua Stevens was a Revolutionary War soldier. He fought at Kings Mountain. And in that engagement, Patrick Ferguson's horse ran down the mountainside after Ferguson was killed. And the person who caught that horse was Cheryl's ancestor, Joseph Stevens, who caught the bridle of the horse. Unfortunately, he didn't get to keep it. His commanding officer took possession of that horse. I guess rank has its privileges. I still think he's a horse thief. Anyway, so Joshua Stevens married Elizabeth Dyer. Now, Joshua Stevens' father was also a Joshua Stevens, Reverend Joshua Stevens, I believe also a Baptist, married Ann Dudley. And the father of Joseph Stevens, Sr., was John A. Stevens, who married Patricia Wright. Now, in some of the genealogies I've looked at, it says that the marriage was Patricia Washington, but that's not correct. The wife of John A. Stevens, Patricia, her father, Patricia's father was Major Francis Wright. Now, her mother might have been a Washington. But this is before the Revolutionary War. No connection to George as far as I know at this time. So that may develop later. The father of John A. Stevens is William Stevens. He's also a junior. Now he's married to Rachel Langton. The father of William Stevens is, of course, William Stevens Sr., married to Mary Seaborn. And the father of that William Stevens is John S. Stevens, who married Ann Wade. And now we're at Jamestown because the father of this John Stevens, who married Ann Wade, is Captain Richard Stevens, who came to America in 1623 on the ship the George. 1623 is an important year. 1622 was a very bad year in Jamestown. That was the year of Opechancano's rebellion. He was an Indian chief of the Powhatan tribe, and some people believe that he had been captured by the Spanish earlier and had been a bunch of places, including back to Spain and in Mexico, and had learned, I think had learned some English before he persuaded them to bring him back to America, where he rejoined his people. There's history controversy in there. There's a question about his identity, but that's too deep to get into today. But nevertheless, Opechancanough was a very important figure in the history of Jamestown, because this rebellion that he led in 1622 came pretty close to wiping out the colony. The Indians killed well over 300 people, somewhere around 350 some odd people were killed in a very well-planned surprise attack, and his attempt was clearly to wipe out the English, but he failed. And the colony had a big setback. They'd lost a lot of people. The years afterwards were difficult, but there were ships of colonists that were continuing to come to Jamestown after this rebellion in 1622. One of those ships was the George, with Captain Stevens on board. Now, he was a pretty well-off fella. He came with somewhere between 2 and 4 servants. We're not sure the exact number, but he had servants with him when he came. And he sponsored other people to come and be colonists. So that took some money. So he was quite well off, and he immediately, when he landed, became one of the more important people in the colony. Now, when he came to America, he was not married. He was a single man, but he had not been in Jamestown very long at all when he married the daughter of a merchant in Jamestown. He's referred to as a cape merchant. I guess that means he sells capes, you know, the piece of cloth you would wear to keep the weather off mainly. Um, so that guy's name was Abraham Piercy, and his daughter was Elizabeth Piercy, and Elizabeth and Richard married. Um, Richard Stevens seems to have gotten in a few scrapes in Jamestown. He fought a duel. In fact, this is, as far as we know, the first duel fought by English settlers in America. So Richard Stevens fought a duel with a guy named George Harrison, not the Beatle. Same name. But I don't know what happened. They got on each other's nerves somehow, and they decided to fight it out. They fought it out with swords. So in this sword duel, George Harrison was wounded in the leg below his knee, and that ended the duel with Richard Stevens being the victor in the duel. However, the wound, according to the doctor who examined Harrison, it wasn't a serious wound. However, nevertheless, George Harrison died a couple of weeks after that duel. But the doctor who wrote about this said that Harrison was already sick and that he died of an illness that was not related to the duel. So there you go. You know, you don't have a lot of information when you're talking about going back to the 1620s, but that's the information that we have, is that the Harrison guy who lost out in this duel with Richard Stevens died, but his death was not related to the duel at all. The other thing that happened with Richard Stevens, first of all, he became a burgess. So a burgess was one of the legislators or rulers of the colony. Richard Stevens became a burgess. So he was in the government, in the governor's council. Also, he was one of the first ones to enclose land near his house. And so this was something that went into the Jamestown records as something that was encouraged, is that they wanted the colonists to fence off land for gardens and so forth. And so this is mentioned in the Jamestown records because Richard Stevens was the first one to do that. So he fenced off a portion of land near his house for a garden. That was kind of important because the English colonists in Jamestown were not very good at feeding themselves. In fact, that's why we had what's referred to as the starving time in Jamestown, where a large part of the colony died because they didn't have any food. Basically, a lot of these people were nobility, and they weren't used to working, and they didn't want to work, and their idea was that they would somehow get the food from the Indians or something, but they were not into going out and plowing and planting and so forth. So that changed around this time. For one thing, John Rolfe started the planting of tobacco, and then people also began around this time to start growing their own food, and so that made them less dependent upon the Indians. Before that, they tended to trade for food. They would give the Indians trade goods, axes, knives, cloth, or whatever, to get corn in return. And sometimes they just went out and took it. particularly when they were at war. But so this thing where Richard Stephens enclosed part of his land for a garden, that was a significant thing in the history of Jamestown. The other thing is he got into another scrap with the governor. The governor at this time was Governor Harvey. Governor Harvey was a very unpopular governor. He made the colonists really angry. I don't know what it was, but Governor Harvey had a way of rubbing people the wrong way. And he and Richard Stephens got into a scrap, and Governor Harvey used either a cane or a club of some kind and hit Richard Stephens and knocked out some of his teeth. So not long after that, and in fact, this fight with Richard Stephens was mentioned in the process of getting rid of Governor Harvey. So Governor Harvey was rejected by the colonists and was sent back to England. They said, we won't have this man to be our governor. And one of their complaints was that he had attacked Richard Stephens. So anyway, a little bit of history here on my wife's side of the family and their connection to Jamestown. Some of the earliest settlement in America. Now he does get there after the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims land in 1620 up in Plymouth, but Jamestown is well established by this time. But you know, if you're thinking about the Pilgrims and their settling of America, well, the Stephens family came to America right at around that time. So 3 years after the Pilgrims, the Stephenses were already there in Jamestown. One more note on Richard Stephens is he died kind of early. We don't know why. People died a lot in Jamestown. The mortality rate was very high. At times, the death rate in Jamestown was as high as 80%. So you really had to be tough to make it in Jamestown. Richard Stephens gave it a good shot, and he got as far as getting there, settling there, becoming an important person there, getting married, and having several sons, and one of whom was John Stephens, from whom my wife Cheryl is descended. He could have died of disease, probably. Probably died of disease. A lot of them did. But so that's our Stephens connection to Jamestown. Next time, we'll talk about how the Hyatts are connected to Jamestown. Thank you.